What's up, everybody? My name is Kevin. I'm the founder of Automatic.css. And in this video, I want to take a look at some of the brand new features available to you right now in Automatic.css 2.2. But before we get to that, I do want to just take a minute and thank all of you because we just have an amazing community here. The way that you guys advocate for Automatic.css, the way you participate in the active development process, the way you participate in the community by helping others out, providing insights, reporting bugs. It is just absolutely phenomenal. It's a better community than we could have ever imagined, and we have you to thank for that. So we want to say Merry Christmas and Happy New Year from myself and the entire Automatic.css team, as well as the Frames team. It's just been a phenomenal year, and you are a big part of that. And because we are so excited and so appreciative of you, we have decided to bake in what we are calling a Merry Christmas feature. This is a feature that was not on the roadmap. It was not originally planned, but it is something that we believe is going to be a true game changer. And we worked extra fast and extra hard to get this feature out in time for Christmas as a thank you to all of you. And let's just take a look at it. Let's go ahead and get in the builder and let's get it going. So I'm going to add a section to the page. I'm going to quickly whip up a 3-column grid. It would help if I actually selected the container. So we're going to do grid _3. We're going to do grid _L1. And we are going to do a gap of M. So that's going to give us a nice responsive 3-column grid. And I'm going to add a block to this grid for my card. And what we're going to do is we're going to build a card with best practices, not a real like involved card or anything like that. Just very, very quick, very simple card, but we are going to give it a custom class. We're going to use BIM, and I want to show you this game-changing new feature that you are just absolutely going to love. And it's one of those features that once you have it, you can never not have it. It's like you are going to be instantly addicted to this feature, okay? So what should we call this card? Let's call it New Year's card, just like that. So Happy New Year's, right? So this is our New Year's card. And in this card, I'm going to add a heading. I'm going to add text, and I'm going to add another text element, which is going to be my link. So we're going to say that this is our call to action. This can just stay like that, and this is going to say card heading. And I'm going to give these some BIM classes, okay? So New Year's card, _, this is going to be the heading. This is going to be our text, and this is going to be our link. All right. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure that that actually is a link so that it shows up properly. Okay, and we're not going to worry about paragraphs and do all of this stuff. That's not the point. The point is to show you how this technique works, or how this new feature works when you are using variables, which happens when you're using custom classes, right? And this is one of the biggest pain points of using variables, the fact that you have to type var, open parentheses, _, then the name of the variable, then a closing parentheses, over and over and over again. It gets kind of annoying. I'll be honest with you, it gets kind of annoying. I was annoyed by it, and we decided to fix it, okay? So now let's say I want to add padding to this card. I'm going to go to Style, Layout, Padding. Instead of typing var, open parentheses, _, then the name, then close, like a chump, right? We don't want to be a chump. I've talked about this in many videos. We don't want to be a chump. It feels very chumpy. It feels very chumpy to write var over and over and over again. Should you have to do that? We think not. So what we would rather do is just type _ M, hit enter, and let Automatic.css take care of all of the chumpy stuff for us, like writing the var and the brackets and all of that. And then I can simply extend this to all sides using the link feature. What about the gap? Like, would this work in a row gap? Well, yeah, actually it does. XS, hit enter, it automatically expands to write my var for me. So what is the formula here? _ is the signal that this is a variable. Then we write the name of the variable, and then we hit enter, and Automatic.css takes care of the rest. But that is not where we stopped. That is not where we stopped, because sometimes you're like, you know what? I would like space XS, but like maybe 10% more. Can I get like 10% more than space XS? Because I don't want to go all the way to space S. The gap is a little too big. I want to kind of fine tune this. And so how would we do that? Well, you've always been able to write a calc function. So you can write a calc, you can put the variable space XS in the calc, then you can multiply it by 1.1. That would be 10% larger. But that's a lot of writing. And frankly, you know, writing a calc over and over again, just as annoying as writing a var over and over again. Well, we've made it a little bit easier. So now you can write space XS times 1.1. And then when I hit enter, guess what, guys? I not only get the var expansion, but I also get the calc expansion at the exact same time. This saves a tremendous amount of time. It saves a tremendous amount of typing. It takes you from Chumpville to like actual enjoyment. You're going to enjoy using variables. See, before we were like, oh, okay, it's a headache, but it does so much value in using variables. I'm going to do it anyway. I'm going to just deal with the headache involved with writing var over and over again, writing calcs all the time. Now you're actually going to enjoy writing variables, using variables, enjoy using calc functions when you need to use calc functions, because Automatic CSS does all the heavy lifting for you. Now, there's another part of this feature, and guys, we're not done yet. Another part of this feature, I'm going to take off one of this brackets. I'm going to malform the expression, and you're going to see that I instantly got a tooltip, and I also get a red border indicating that we have a broken function here. And this is actually very important. Even with a var, if you write var, oopsie, I wrote car. If you write var space S and you forget the closing bracket, this isn't just an Automatic CSS issue. This is a CSS issue. CSS hates this. In fact, it will break your entire site. From this element down the page, your entire site will lose all of its styling. And this will happen from time to time when you're moving quickly. And unfortunately, when it happens, you don't even realize that it happened a lot of times. So you'll end up doing a lot of work on the page. You'll save, then you'll go to the front end and everything is broken. And you're like, what has happened? The whole site has blown up. It's actually a malformed variable, and you've forgotten a bracket somewhere. And because of that, your entire site is broken, and you don't know where the malformed variable is. You now have to go back, and you have to go on like a hunt for the broken variable. And then you have to fix it by adding the bracket. Well, now Automatic CSS attempts to warn you that this is happening in real time by saying, hey, dude, you have forgotten a bracket here. There's unbalanced brackets in your variable or in your calc function or whatever you were whatever you were doing at the time. And so now you're able to come in, you're able to fix that variable, and all is well in the world. No broken site, no broken variables. And by the way, that really only ever happened when you were writing the vars manually. When you use automatic var expansion, it's never going to happen. You're never going to end up with a broken variable and a broken site, because Automatic CSS always puts in the appropriate amount of brackets for you, and there's no chance in leaving one off, okay? But we're still not done here. We're still not done. The question may be, but Kevin, what if I'm writing custom CSS? I get it. You've added this feature to the inputs. What if I want to write custom CSS? How would that work, right? Okay, well, let's take a look. We're going to go to the root level. This is what you do in bricks when you're writing custom CSS on an element. And we're going to put in our gap just like we had before. Now, there is one little slight difference here. I'm going to write space XS just like I did before, but instead of hitting enter, I'm going to use the semicolon, just like I'm ending a normal instruction in CSS. And I get automatic var expansion. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, Kevin, does that actually work with a calc as well in CSS? Well, yes, it actually does. So text XS times 1.1, I want it to be 10% larger, semicolon, gives me an automatic variable expansion and automatic calc expansion in that string. Guys, this is, when I use the word game-changing feature, this is one of those game-changing features. It is going to change your workflow in a way that you are never going to want to go back, because you're never going to want to be a chump. You're never going to want to type the word. What value is there to you in typing var over and over and over again, or typing calc over and over and over again. Once you don't have to do it, you're never going to want to do it ever again. So this is one of those features that you are going to be instantly addicted to, and you're going to wonder, how did I live without this before Automatic CSS? Okay. Let's move on to our next set of features. So our next set of features is contextual variables and contextual utility classes. And I need to explain this just a little bit. Okay, so I am going to, I'm just going to add the gap in real quick right here. So we're going to do gap of XS just like we had before. Oh, sorry, it's not gap XS, it's space XS. Okay, so then I'm going to save. We do need to give this a little bit of a background color as well. So I'm going to go in here and give this a, let's go to base ultra light. Perfect. And then what I can do is just duplicate some of these cards. Maybe we'll get to 6 of them. I want to remove my gap from my grid. And then I want to actually add a container in this section for like a little introduction. So we're going to have a heading, and we're going to have text just like that. This is going to be an H2 because it's a section heading. And this is just going to say section heading, just like that. I am going to drag this up to the top. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a button down below. This is going to be another call to action for this section in general, and I'll do a button action on that. Okay, so now you see I have a container, I have another container for my grid, and I have another button. It's not in a container, but it doesn't have to be in a container, but it's kind of in the position of where another container would be in terms of like spacing this content out. And what we have to do now is talk about contextual variables. We actually borrowed this technique from frames. I was the first to introduce this concept that I know of in CSS in general, and it goes along the lines of this. We have these things called utility classes, and if you use them in certain areas, like, for example, I want to space all these containers out, right? So in this section, I'm going to go to row gap, and I'm either going to put a variable like space XL as an example. Let's do that. Or actually, I could just come up here and do a utility class of gap XL. It's going to give me the exact same effect, right? So that's spacing all my content out. Then I could come to my grid, right? I'm showing you the old way of doing this. And I could say, I want a gap of M on my grid. All right, that's perfect. And, oh, what about this content right here? I actually want a gap of S on that content. So I've got a gap of S for my content. I've got a gap of XL for my containers, and I've got a gap of M for my grid. Now, this presents some problems. And the problems are, well, there are numerous problems. Number one, I have to remember the values. So I have to remember that I'm using XL spacing between all of my containers. I have to remember that my grids are using M gap. I have to remember that my content is using S gap. And then if I do remember all those things and I'm very consistent with those values across the website, I will actually have good consistency. But I still have a big problem. If I ever decide, you know what, all these containers, right, the spacing between my containers in my sections, I want to tighten that up, or I want to loosen that up. Or what about my grids? Maybe I'm like, I want to tighten that grid spacing up, or I want to loosen that grid spacing up across my entire website. What about my content? Do you know how much content there is on a website? Well, if you're using a random gap variable for that, or gap class, yeah, even if you use the same one over and over again, you can't ever change it. You can't ever say, well, I want to loosen up the spacing between my content or tighten up the spacing between my content, because in order to make these changes, you would have to go to all instances of your grid, all instances of your content, all instances of your containers, and make those changes. And that is Chumpville. That is chump life, okay? And you are going to be very dedicated for a very long time making all of those changes. These, it turns out, are very important, pivotal aspects of our design. The gaps in our grids, the spacing between our content, the spacing between our containers. We do not want to be using random spacing values in these areas, because then we have no control. You can't ever change the value of gap S because you don't know where it was used. You can't ever change the value of gap M because you don't know where it's been used. But we introduced this concept of contextual utility classes and contextual variables, where we're using a variable or a class in a specific context. There are 3 specific contexts that we are starting with. And this, again, was used in frames. We validated how valuable this concept is in frames, and now we've brought it to Automatic CSS. They are content gap, container gap, and grid gap. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take away this gap XL, I'm going to take away this gap S, and I'm going to take away this gap M on my grid. And I'm going to replace those generic classes, and we have generic variables that match them, obviously, with contextual classes or contextual variables. So, for example, my containers, very easy, all get container gap. So all my sections have container gap on them, and that spaces out my containers. In my grids, if I can go select my grid, I'm going to use, what would you think it would be? Grid gap, right? Very easy to remember. You don't have to remember, what was my value for this? Does it pass the 3-month rule? Guys, of course it passes the 3-month rule. You don't have to know what the value of the gap is. You just have to know that it's a grid gap. Every grid, use grid gap, you're good to go. Every section, use container gap, you're good to go. And then within your containers, within your blocks, within your elements, you're going to use content gap. And again, this can be, well, let me refresh my builder because I had an errant value in there. There we go. That looks much better. Okay. So all I have to know, I don't need to know, was that an S? Was that an M? Was that an L? You don't have to know. You just have to know that this is content. So we're using content gap. This is a grid, so we're using grid gap. This is a section, so we're using container gap because containers are living within your sections, all right? So we hit save, and we view this on the front end. And now look what this gives us the ability to do. Let's say you want to tighten up the spacing on all of your grids. So you're going to go back into the dashboard, you're going to go to spacing, and you're going to see that these 3 contextual utilities are controlled from the dashboard. Here's your grid gap. Right now it is space M. I'm going to change it to space XS and hit save. And now we're going to go to the front end of the website. All of your grids will tighten up across the entire website. All of your grids will tighten up. You want to loosen them up? Oh, you want it XL? Okay, no problem. We can do that. We can loosen up the spacing in all of our grids. Now, what about the spacing between our containers? Well, do we want to, we want to expand that a little bit? I'll go to container gap, change it from XL to XXL. We'll go refresh. Watch the spacing between this heading intro section and this grid and this button down here. It all just got a little bit wider. You want to really tighten those things up? No problem. Container gap XS. And by the way, guys, you can use whatever values you want here. I would recommend using variables, but you can use whatever you want. You want to use a calc? You can use a calc there. You can use whatever you want. There's no limitation. Look how tight our spacing got, okay? Is that practical? Would you want to do that? No, but you can, okay? So container gap, let's put it back at XL. What about our content gap? Maybe we want to tighten up all of our spacing between our content on the website. Well, very easy to do that. I go back, look at the gap has changed here. I'm back to having an XL gap here and here. And then I want to get my grid gap back to what it was, kind of a normal thing of M. I'll save and I will refresh. Guys, you can make these adjustments even after a website is entirely built and finished. Why? Because it makes these changes safe. You know exactly where the change is going to be applied. In combination with being able to change all of your spacing across the board, like you already know how to do with the spacing scale adjustments in Automatic CSS or the base spacing in Automatic CSS, you now have granular control over specific areas of spacing. This is phenomenally powerful. It is another game changer. And I'm not saying game changer lightly. We've been using this technique in frames. We've been using this technique in our own projects. Once you have used this technique, you will not want to ever not use it again. It's a yet another technique that you are going to feel addicted to once you start using it. Again, contextual utilities, variables, and classes. All right, the final feature that we are going to take a look at involves our grids. We're going to create a section here. I'm going to turn this container into a grid. And in fact, instead of using utility classes, I am going to use a custom class. We're going to say that this is a special, we'll call this a variable grid, just like that. And that is the whole point of this feature, is that you can now define grids with Automatic CSS using variables. And this release just happens to coincide with the release of Bricks 1.6.1, which now has support for grid, CSS grid, using grid template columns and rows and auto columns and all this other fancy stuff. But with Automatic CSS, all you have to do is in the grid template columns box, use one of the new grid variables. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to quickly add some blocks to this grid. I don't even know how many I added. Doesn't really matter. And what we're going to do is on this custom class, we are going to use a variable such as grid3. And you see, I instantly get a 3-column grid. The benefit here is that I don't need to know how to write the grid template column instructions for 3-column grid. And I can assign this grid structure now to a custom class, which means I have a single source of truth over this grid. I am free to use this grid on a gazillion pages. And if I ever need to change its structure, I can easily change it from one place. If I ever need to change its gap, sorry, I set that back to flex. I meant to click on this box right here. So I do something like, grid gap perhaps. So I use my contextual utility variable, var grid gap. So I can always have control over the structure of this grid. 8 months from now, let's say this is a services grid and I have 9 services right here. Here's 9 cards. And I need to add a 10th service. So this grid is going to have 10 cards. Oh no, womp womp, right? I don't want a dangler service card down here. I need to change this to a 2-column grid structure. So I come to my class right here. My variable changes from grid 3 to grid 2. I now have a 2-column grid, and that applies to everywhere this grid has been used. Everywhere I've used variable grid, which really would be something like service grid or something like that, because it would be for your service cards, or it could be something like testimonial grid. So all of your testimonial grids use the exact same structure. That part is up to you. The point now is that you can use full 12-column grid. You can use your auto grids. You can use your uneven grids, grid 2-3, grid 3-2, those kinds of things. All of the grid structures that are available to you in Automatic CSS can now be referenced with grid variables. This is powerful for creating scalable, maintainable, custom grids. And again, because Bricks 1.6.1 now supports CSS grid natively, those two features they go perfect together. And it just happened to be perfect timing. We didn't plan this. We just got lucky, okay? So that is our features. Let me go back to camera here. That is our features for Automatic CSS 2.2. Again, we thank you so much. Big thanks from me, the entire ACSS team, the entire Framed team. You guys are an awesome community. We love serving you. We love supporting you. We cannot wait for 2023 because we have so much more planned and so much more coming. We love you guys. We will see you next year. Cheers.